Welcome to Brand New Taste, a podcast for brands in the food and beverage industry, focusing on new innovation and how understanding taste is vital to commercial success. Your hosts are Brandt Maybury and Micah Carr-Hill, co-founders of the leading development agency, Tastehead.
Hello, Micah.
Hi, Brandt. How are you?
Not bad. Back for another episode.
Yeah, it's becoming a bit of a habit, isn't it?
Yeah. Good habit, I hope.
Yeah, one of my better habits. Yeah. But I mean, you're seeming rather chipper today.
Well, I mean, it could have something to do with the fact that I'm off to California at the weekend for a few weeks.
Lucky you.
So I know, hard to not be sort of chipper and excited with that. Half holiday, half work. Some interesting projects that looking forward to sharing the results of, maybe on this podcast. When we
in the
get back.
future.
Yeah, lots of trends over in California.
Very different
unsurprisingly.
to here.
Yeah. So be interesting to see what's going on and bring some details back. Speaking of trends,
As you like to.
today's episode is going to be covering an ever-growing trend. And so, first of all, a question for you. How's your gut health these days? What sort of food are you eating? What did you have for dinner last night?
Well, so dinner last night was an old classic, cauliflower cheese with some sausages from one of my favoured butchers. Bit of English mustard on the side.
You got to shout out the butcher, surely.
Swaledale
Nice.
this occasion.
Nice.
Not my only sauce, but
No.
they're very good. So yeah, that was very good.
Glass of wine?
Yeah, a nice bottle of wine, obviously, as you know. I have.
Apologies for suggesting it would be a glass.
No. So yeah, cracked open a lovely Italian, a Barolo, as you know, from the Nebbiolo grape.
Yeah.
Very tasty. Yeah, but what about
Tar and roses?
tar and rose, the
Barolo?
classic
Yeah.
flavours?
Very interesting
Yeah,
one.
yeah. But anyway, what about yours? How's your gut health?
Well, I mean, before I get onto mine, it seems like you can, in my experience, basically sort of eat. You eat well and balanced, but you don't really take too much thought if you're going to indulge with a sort of midweek glass of wine or a slightly richer dinner. And so do you take sort of probiotics and prebiotics and lots of supplements to support that?
What do you think?
I've not seen you take any.
I'm not a pill merchant. I do eat well, like you say, a balanced diet, cook pretty much everything myself, unless I'm going out somewhere fine. But no, I mean, I've never felt the need for it, to be honest. But I think it might be slightly different for you.
It is, sadly, for me. Yeah, as you know, my gut health is a constant sort of battle. I had my microbiome tested a few years ago, and it confirmed my suspicions that it wasn't good. And so since around 2006, when I broke my back in a snowboarding accident, I had to have a couple of operations, and one thing and another, had been sort of really healthy and able to eat whatever I wanted by that point. And then I just started to see my health deteriorate. And it was my gut health first, and then it had a real sort of knock-on effect to other things. And I really had to look at my own health and see what I could do to get back on track. And a really big thing for me was all around my diet and my gut health. So I'm pretty good now. I can sort of indulge every now and again, but have to keep an eye on it. I take probiotics, prebiotics, make sure I get lots of fibre, things like that. Otherwise, I'm only ever a cheap sausage roll away from sort of having some gut-related issues.
But why would you be eating a cheap sausage roll?
I wouldn't, unless the sort of the.
Unless Matt has offered you one. Matt at work, yeah.
Oh, he loves a pasty or a sausage roll.
He
does.
A big fan.
Yeah.
Big fan.
Yeah, but this story of mine, it's all too familiar and common now.
It is.
And I think gut health is a trend that whenever I'm asked what trends do I sort of see on the horizon, which ones are going to continue, which ones are going to fade away, the one I always pick first as not only is going to continue, but I think is going to grow sort of exponentially, is around gut health. Part of the reason being, people have been aware of the kind of connection with your gut and health for like thousands of years. But it's only in recent years, literally in the last 5 or 10 years, that you're starting to see actual science that's suggesting why it's so important and proving it. For instance, some of the diseases that are being linked nowadays: irritable bowel syndrome, inflammatory bowel disease, celiac disease, colorectal cancer, obesity, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, diseases of the liver. And I'll stop there, but there's more and more diseases and health-related issues that are showing links to gut health. Now, I think it's important we caveat this episode by saying we're not doctors.
We're not medical men.
No. We're going to try and not kind of overstep our boundaries. What we're going to go through, we hopefully have got our sources cited. We'll put those in the description of the episode. So when we refer to studies and so on, people can go and do their own research. But we thought it would be good to just share our views and insights on the world of gut health. I think we break it down this episode into a structure where we'll have a very short introduction to gut health for those who aren't too familiar with the details. Then we'll move into why it's important and so relevant. Then we'll move on to what the current innovations are and any ideas that we have. And then we'll finish with looking at what the future trends are and where we think things are heading.
Sounds like a good plan.
Yeah. So Micah, how do we define the gut and gut health? What are we talking about exactly?
So in this case, when we're talking about the gut, we're talking about the stomach, small intestine, and the large intestine. And what we're looking at is what most affects its health. Now, there are a number of things that will affect your gut's health, but the one we're focusing on, and the most important, is the microbiome. And to sort of explain what that is, I'm going to come with an analogy for you. Think of your microbiome as your garden. And what we need to do is make sure that the soil that the plants grow in is healthy, containing plenty of nutrients. And in this case, in this analogy, the soil is your intestines and the plants are your microbes. Now, to stop weeds or poisonous plants taking over, in this analogy, we're talking about toxic or disease microbes. We need to cultivate the widest variety of plants and seeds possible.
And so with these microbes, they come in several different groups and families. Not going to mention them all. I'm not even sure how accurately I'd be able to pronounce half of them. The two main ones that make up about 90% of a healthy gut, the two main families are Bacteroidetes and Firmicutes. The remaining 10% are made up of several other different groups and families. The most important one is Proteobacteria. Now, this is the family that is closest linked or related to inflammation and disease. And when I had my gut microbiome tested years ago, I can't remember if it was UBiome or the American Gut Research. There was a couple of businesses offering that as a service. My Proteobacteria was like a third instead of 10%.
Yeah.
And so it showed that I had a gut bacteria that was more sort of linked to disease. And I think people who struggle with gut health, etc., it's often the Proteobacteria that is higher than it needs to be.
Yeah. And I had mine done. I don't know if it was a bit after or similar time to you. Again, I can't remember who did it, but I think I showed you the results because you've been sort of more knowledgeable about this with all the issues you've had.
I remember being quite envious.
I showed you the picture of them, and I said, "What's this mean?" You said, "Oh no, you're fine, mate." So that again, it's only a sample of two, but that showed that why I probably have a better gut health, and I don't have any problems, whereas you do because of the situation you were in. Yeah,
and so in terms of sort of looking after that microbiome, the two words that people are now mostly familiar with are probiotics and prebiotics. So let's break that down. So probiotics, they're essentially the microbe that we ingest through foods, or in this case nowadays, products. The two main species of probiotics that you'll read or hear about are lactobacilli and bifidobacteria. And so these are the groups that are feeding and replacing, the sort of important healthy microbes in your gut. Now, the prebiotics, they're not actually microbes. I know there's a bit of confusion around this and people often get confused between probiotics, prebiotics. Prebiotics are basically prebiotic fibers. these are the fibres that feed the probiotic bacteria, support sort of a healthy microbiome. And I think you've got something that helps you remember the difference between prebiotic and probiotic.
We discussed this, and I said I can never remember. And you say, how can you not remember? And it's different for different people, but it's actually Lulu at work who told me this. So we were discussing the same thing. She said, remember the difference is prebiotics feed your gut. And you just laughed in my face like I was an
As
idiot.
I am now.
Yeah, exactly. But since then, it was only a few weeks ago. Since then, I remember. So hopefully for some of our listeners, that will help them as well.
Yeah, however it works.
Now, we won't go into too much detail here because we've got so much more to talk about, but there's some good things to sort of check out. And one sort of person I've read a lot, and as have you, is Tim Spector, a professor of genetic epidemiology at King's College London. He's written a lot about this. He's part of the British Gut Project, the Zoe app. He did the largest microbiome project in the UK. So read any of his stuff. It's great.
I think in the last 3 years, a lot more people are aware of him because of his work on the Zoe app, and it's been on the news and online in terms of updating COVID and so on. But yeah, we were reading his books sort of quite a few years before that, all about gut health, and yeah, absolutely. Another resource that I'd like to sort of direct people to go and check out, it's actually a client of ours, The Gut Stuff. So they came to us a few years ago. They Alana and Lisa had created this website, The Gut Stuff, where it was all about sharing information and support around sort of gut health, etc. And they wanted to launch their first range of snack bars that would be sort of high in prebiotic fibres and, would support sort of gut health. And their website is brilliant. I think they do a great job of helping to put the science into an easy to digest format, sort of partly or similar to what we're going to try and do in this episode as well. But for instance, one of the analogies that they've got is if your gut is the band, your stomach, liver, pancreas, and gallbladder are accessory organs. Think of them as groupies to the band. So, they're a really good resource of just sort of putting it into layman's terms and helping people retain information. Okay, so moving on now to why gut health is so important and so relevant today.
Yeah, I mean, let's first look back a bit and just see, are we sort of ingesting and eating the same sort of thing as our ancestors? I mean, what we know from sort of data is that 15,000 years ago, our ancestors actually ingested around 150 ingredients per week. Now, how many do you think is the average amount that people ingest per week now?
20, because it's written down here in front of me.
Brilliant. If you hadn't had it written down in front of you, what would you have said?
I'd have guessed a lot higher. I'd have said 50, 60, 70. I mean, 20, that's low.
That's really low. I mean, obviously that's not everyone. And if you make a lot of your own food and use a lot of spices and a lot of herbs and a lot of other ingredients, then it's not that. But that just shows how much of the population have a very limited diet. And that will go towards having a not very healthy gut.
And I believe that has led us to having around 1/10 of the variety of species of probiotic bacteria in our gut to our ancestors. When they look at, you can really see it basically. I think I seem to remember reading that our ancestors had around 10,000 different strains, whereas we have close to 1,000 on average now.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that's really important is because a lot of people do eat processed foods, because that's what a lot of supermarket food is. A lot of those, the base of those is really largely 4 ingredients, which is corn, soy, wheat, and meat based. And these are, just shows that the sort of lack of variety that we're seeing in these sorts of food and drink products.
You're listening to Brand New Taste. Your hosts are Micah Carr-Hill, food scientist, product developer and taste expert, who has held the position of Head of Taste at premium brands Green & Blacks and Corsten Press. And Brandt Maybury, development chef, taste specialist and managing director of Tastehead, leading innovation projects for brands of all sizes.
There was a survey by Euromonitor International in 2020 that showed about 1/4 of consumers globally are suffering from issues related to gut health, with half of the reported cases are claiming to affect the consumer's health in general. So it sort of shows the impact that it's having is quite clear.
A big reason for that, we think, is that only about 9% of adults all around the world are getting the adequate amount of fibre daily. And as you remember, we've been talking about the fibre is so important as a prebiotic to feed those microbes. In the UK, for instance, the average of fibre per day is 20 grams. And it's even less in the US, for instance, about 15 to 20. Recommended, 30 grams. So that's going to make a lot of difference to the health of your gut.
Yeah, and some people are certainly eating a lot less than 20 grams.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Are we seeing, what'll be interesting to know is, are we seeing fibre in different categories now?
Yeah, one of the categories we've had a few projects on in the last few years has been in the baby food category. And that's really interesting, starting to see how things like fibre and gut health are starting to expand into those categories. It was interesting because when we had our first baby food project, Gemma, my wife, was pregnant. And so we had our little Oscar on the way. And so it sort of had a bit more relevance for me. And then in the last couple of years, we've had a couple of others as well, which has been interesting alongside the experience of actually feeding a baby and a toddler and seeing some of the challenges that we had with Oscar, because he had some sort of, should we say, digestive issues in the first few sort of weeks and months of his life. And I looked into it quite a lot. And what was interesting, there's a number of studies, I'll put some links in the description, where they've actually tested inulin powder, so essentially, a fibre supplement in newborns and really young toddlers. And it's had almost nothing but positive effects and impacts in terms of their health and their gut health. Fairly high doses, to be honest, or certainly what would seem high for such young children. Obviously, the only negative impacts are sort of, the
windy,
bit windy.
Windy.
But yeah, it's definitely something that is starting to be seen in the baby food category. And it's so important because the data is showing that your microbiome, you're born with a lot of it, but the first 1 to 3 years is where you can actually change it, and for the better or for the worse, obviously. And so it's a very key part of life that by the time 3 years old, it then becomes very difficult to make drastic changes in a short space of time.
This is why I think it's really important if you've got kids in those early years, is to feed them this wide range of food and like you say, include some fibre. And as you know, my son, unfortunately, he doesn't eat, so he's on a formula. Now the formula we had didn't have any fibre. We added some fibre to it, but his gut was not great. Then we were told, well, actually, you can get one with fibre added. And since he had that, almost like overnight, just so much better. It just shows the importance of having some fibre in your diet.
Yeah, we're seeing added fibre in almost every category, to be fair. We've called out baby food there, but we're seeing it in functional drinks, in baking, in ready meals, in confectionery even. And there's one ingredient in particular that just keeps coming up again and again in our development kitchen, and that is chicory root fibre syrup.
Can't get enough of it.
I know we can't. Well, we actually couldn't. Last year there was global shortages because so many brands are now switching over from what they were using previously, such as isomalto-oligosaccharide, which
well done.
Thank you. Yeah. I've said that one a few times, so I can roll that one out quite easily. Much cheaper, but people don't like seeing isomalto-oligosaccharide on the back of ingredients. And it is, in terms of how it's produced, it is potentially more processed than what's processed from chicory. So you see it in so many ingredients. And the reason it's in there, obviously it does have a high amount of fibre. I think it varies from about 60 to 70%, depending on the source. Yeah. But the other reason it's so popular is it's fairly neutral in both colour. It's fairly clear, has a slightly golden hue to it, mostly clear. Has a low amount of sweetness, a little bit of sweetness, but the actual sugar content is, I think, less than 10%. And it can be really good for replacing syrups, where they would be used not just for sweetening, but also for their sort of technical properties, whether it's the texture it gives to cakes or the fact that it dissolves so easily into cold beverages, etc. So yeah, it's one of the most important ingredients that we have in our kitchen for sure.
Yeah.
So we know then that fibre is incredibly beneficial for your gut microbiome. It supports it. But there's also things that you consume and people often do that can disrupt your microbiome. Like you alluded to earlier, the amount of processed foods that we have can have an impact, and artificial additives as well. One of the ones that we'll just sort of call out because there's some data on it now, artificial sweeteners.
Yeah, exactly. So there was a study back in 2008 that it was a study around diet drinks in rats. And what they found, the researchers, is that they fed them sucralose. Now, sucralose is one of the main artificial sweeteners that's used in a lot of products, both drinks and food. And it's got sucralose sounds a bit like sugar, but the actual name for it is 1,6-dichloro 1,6-dideo-oxy-beta-D fructofuranosyl 4-chloro-4-deo-oxy-alpha-D galactopyranoside. Almost got that through that without, but it just this is it's a big molecule. And what they found is they fed the rats the equivalent of a recommended human dose for around 12 weeks, and they had a significant reduction in their total microbe count. So what you're doing is getting the opposite of something like fibre. And not only did they find that up to 3 months afterwards, this was still the case. So it had an effect that carried on for a while.
Yeah.
I think you've also got a study that you remember reading a while back.
I remember reading a similar study, and it sort of broke it down for me in sort of, it really made it quite profound in that there was 3 groups of mice or rats that were in the test, and they're all fed the same food diet, but what changed was what they drank. First group essentially drank water. Second group drank sugar water, so like a kind of a classic fizzy drink, shall we say. And then the third group drank water with an artificial sweetener, so like a diet soda. And what they found is the group that drank water, their weight maintained, stayed the same. Second group that drank sugar water put on weight.
Unsurprising.
But the third group that drank the sweetened water without any sugar in, they put on more weight than any of the other 2 groups. So they put on more weight than the group that drank the sugar water.
That's interesting.
And the reason being that it's how much that these artificial sweeteners and other additives, if consumed regularly, I imagine, they do have the power to impact your microbiome to the point where it starts to impact your metabolism. And so talking about things that disrupt your microbiome and the issues that can arise from that, allergies is actually a really interesting area that some evidence and science is starting to show how linked to your gut health and microbiome that is.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one. I mean, first and foremost, I think what we need to understand is allergies, food intolerance, these are relatively new discoveries.
Yeah.
The first medical mention of an allergy, which was eggs and cow's milk, was in 1912. You know what happened in 1912? Titanic sank. So it's sort of relatively recent history. And the first food allergy case to appear in a modern medical journal, so something that's more than just a medical mention, it's in 1969, the year man landed on the moon. So these are all sort of relatively new, but now we sort of see it quite a lot. And you go to a restaurant, they always say, have you got any allergies, intolerances? And now it's just part and parcel of what we see. But what's interesting to both of us, I think, is that there is evidence to show that if you expose babies, toddlers really early to a number of allergens, it'll mean they're less likely to become allergic later on in their life. And so having this diverse microbiome as a newborn appears to help. So, having breast milk from your mother who's got a healthy diet herself, late weaning, less household cleanliness, getting a few of those bugs, germs into your gut, having pets, these are all really good for the gut health.
Yeah, and the NHS recommendations now are to introduce allergies as early as possible with babies and toddlers. We've done a couple of focus groups recently for Baby Food Project, and about sort of a third to half of the mums there are aware of this advice now, whereas 5 or 10 years ago, I think it was the other way. It was avoid them, and that can be dangerous, just as you've identified there. Something else that's showing links now to your gut microbiome is how your foods are prepared. And the results are quite interesting because there's a study here that I found it quite surprising. I was looking at pasta. So it was a study on 500 adults. It was posted in Diabetes Therapy. It's carried out by Viome Research Institute. And it looked at how the body reacted to pasta that was cooked fresh and eaten straight away versus pasta that was cooked fresh, cooled down, eaten when it was cold, but also cooled down and reheated. And what you find with the freshly cooked pasta is the carbohydrates are very starchy at this point. So it sort of spikes your insulin response to deal with the spike in blood sugars and, can have some negative impacts on your health for that reaction. This is what's all linked to diabetes, etc. Yeah. But what was really interesting is once the pasta's cooled, those starchy carbohydrates start to turn into a form of resistant starch. So resistant starch tends to act more similarly to dietary fibre, so like the prebiotic fibres that we were discussing. And so they pass through the small intestine and make their way into the larger intestine. And so just in terms of the temperature at which allowing the pasta to cool made it far more beneficial for your gut microbiome and your sort of insulin response. But what was really interesting was even reheating the pasta still kept most of the benefits.
And obviously what this means is that, if you're cooking at home, like a pasta dish that you made maybe a nice fresh sauce or whatever, that might not actually in some ways be as good for you as something bought in the supermarket, a ready meal that has pasta in it, because there it's been cooked, cooled down, and you're reheating it.
Yeah.
So this might be a case where something that has gone through more processes actually could be better for you.
Yeah. And obviously, if you cook from fresh at home, you've got other benefits that are going into that. But it's just interesting that you wouldn't assume that something that's been cooked, cooled down, and then reheated would have beneficial properties than cooking fresh. Yeah. And what's going to be quite interesting as we now start to move into the trends that we're starting to see is whether that's going to start to be adopted. Are people going to use that to their advantage? Are they going to communicate that? Because if that's the case with pasta, what else is that the case with? Is it certain breads and pastries and bakery products? Anything else? Can that sort of same science be applied to drinks or other categories?
Exactly. I mean, I think this is really important because we've talked a lot about pro and prebiotics. But this is the case where, yes, it turns into a prebiotic, but it's just part and parcel of the process it's gone through. So we're talking about discovery of how foods change through their sort of journey of being made into something and before they're being consumed. And like you said, it's about communicating these, because this was obviously already happening. But you knew about this. I didn't know about it, and we're people who are in the industry, so it's not well known, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's now move on to trends, the current trends that we're seeing in the gut health arena in food and drink. What sort of innovations we've seen, maybe, and also some of our views and experiences we've seen over the last few years.
Yeah, the first one I have to mention is this shift from volume to variety across so many aspects. So most people, if they take a probiotic supplement, they'll look for, how many billions of probiotic bacteria is it? Again, what the research is showing now is, especially with probiotics, how many billions, whether it's 2 billion, 5 billion, 10 billion in a dose, is often not as important as how many different strains of probiotic bacteria do you have. So the probiotics that I take have 11 different strains in them. And that is supposed to be far more beneficial having, let's say 5 billion probiotic count per serving from 11 different strains than 20 or 30 or 50 from a singular strain. Because going back to what we were saying about our ancestors having just such a more diverse microbiome than we do, it's that diversity that seems to be linked to good health. So we know that it's important in terms of the microbiome, the bacteria that live inside of our gut. But to feed that and to encourage it, you've got to see that variety in the ingredients, in the products that we consume. So whilst previously, just putting in a single strain of probiotics into a product, or just making sure that you've got a source of fibre in there, I think you're starting to see brands now that are taking this research and implementing it by having a wider variety of ingredients. It's not a brand that we've sort of worked on or had any attachment with, but Olipop's in the US, they were sort of a really interesting innovation where they have, outside of the ingredients that are there for, just to sweeten the drink and to flavour it, they've got an additional 8 different ingredients that are there to promote gut health. Ingredients such as cassava root, Jerusalem artichoke, slippery elm bark. And
Favourite.
and so this variety supposedly is going to be what sort of supports having a good variety in your microbiome.
Listen, these are, in this case, these will be prebiotics. Obviously,
Yes.
these are fibres. But different fibres will also help with that diversity because they're feeding the different microbes.
Yeah. So variety in the probiotics you're taking and variety in the prebiotics that you're taking. Because something else that happens is that this variety, it declines with age as well. So as you get older, the variety of species that you have in your gut declines, and it's very difficult to stop that from happening. And so the longer that you can obviously support having a good variety of bacteria in your gut, your health is going to go on for longer.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it goes back to our whole thing around start as early as you can as babies, toddlers, feeding your kids right throughout your life. Keep on going. If you need some help with some probiotics, fine. But we all can eat prebiotics. You don't have to have particular ones necessarily.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be a supplement either.
No.
It's just that variety.
Yeah, exactly. Another thing I think is important in trends is not just, we'll go on to the actual foods, but we're seeing a lot of our suppliers come up with actual ingredients that can be added into food. So for instance, Kerry, a very sort of well-known ingredient supplier, has Ganadin, which is a probiotic. I think it's encapsulated.
Yeah, well, it's a powder, but it's encapsulated because obviously these probiotic microbes, they're living, and so they don't like going in an oven at 180 degrees or being pasteurized or in a sort of high acidity beverage typically. But the process that Kerry have, and I think there are other companies that are catching up as well, but the one that we've used previously, the Ganadin, it does have more resistance than just a regular probiotic supplement. So you're now starting to see products that otherwise wouldn't have been able to have the living probiotic bacteria in the product. You're starting to see that now in bakery products and confectionery and so on, because they're starting to encapsulate it, as you say, and protect those probiotic bacteria through the sort of various processes of making a food or beverage product.
Another trend is fermented foods. We're seeing a lot of fermented foods across drinks and food. Some of these have been around for quite a while. The obvious one to me, I don't know what you think, is Yakult, which, this was one that I remember being advertised probably 20 years ago, maybe longer, which is obviously a sort of yogurt-based drink, but always talking about the amount of sort of microbes in there. But now we're seeing it across all categories. Kefir. Now, I see you've bought me a bottle of kefir very kindly. It's still quite close to you. I know it's for me.
This is my kefir. Keep your hands off.
All right. But this is one that, you've spoken about this brand before, and you sort of saw it and thought this was going to be a trend, and it's turned out to be so.
Yeah, well, it's been around for thousands of years, but what I like about Biotiful, is that just the marketing and the branding, they sort of just made it a lot more sort of accessible and less kind of health, and started to dial up taste. And it tastes delicious. It's really nice. And so this is, if I'm sort of about my day and want to have something on the go, I'll have one of these. Now, because it tastes so nice, I don't know if it's the most effective kefir in the world that you can get, because we've had other kefirs that I know I've subjected you to that
and my dad
are quite different.
Yeah, so because we buy the same one at home, and like you say, it's really tasty. But one day after you've been researching probably all night about what has the best range of probiotics, you came up with this bottle called Chuckling Goat.
The Chuckling Goat.
Yeah. And not only you didn't even have to keep it in the fridge, and they said it lasts for months, and then you gave me a bit, and well, it's an interesting flavour.
The bottle, I think they come in 1.5, 2 litre bottles, and it almost feels like it's about ready to burst. It's so fizzy. It's an interesting sort of business as well, because I'll leave the listener to go and have a look into it if they want. But it's essentially, from what I remember, a farm that had goats, and they were looking for new revenue opportunities, and so they started making kefir, and it's all direct to consumer. So it's a really good example of the direct to consumer model, because they were doing this quite a few years ago. But yeah, it's essentially really fizzy. it's really sour,
Really goaty.
really goaty as well. But you drink just like a shot of that and you think, wow, that has got some serious microbes going on. And I think it's, in terms of talking about trends, a big part of it is trying to be on the right line of function and effectiveness versus taste. Because I will drink that chuckling goat kefir because I know all the benefit that it's given me, but the amount of people I've tried to give it to, and no, I'll go back. And so I think it's important to not, you've got to be pragmatic about this if you're a brand, and you don't want to go too far. So that's going to be interesting to see how, with sort of data and the science and awareness, if people's attitudes and openness to sort of having things that are maybe a bit more challenging, if that changes, or if people still always just revert back to what tastes best.
Yeah, we've seen it also this, because like you said, it's a shot, and we've seen the shots of the juices. We had one earlier, ginger shot, turmeric shots. So obviously these come from a sort of different sort of health benefit side, but people are used to having things which maybe aren't the tastiest things, but they know they're getting a real hit because of the flavour. So I think people are prepared to maybe forego a bit of the taste if they think it's doing them really, real sort of solid work in there, as it were.
Yeah. Another one is kombucha, which you've got a bit of experience with.
Yeah, so kombucha I think is a really interesting one. I've even tried to make my own. It was very acidic, the one I made. But the brand that I know very well is LA Brewery. That is it's very tasty kombucha. It's not too acidic, and they've got some really tasty flavors, really natural tasting. It's a good, actually, talking about trends, it's a good non-alcoholic sort of beverage because it has, with the acid and the lower sweetness.
They have it in lovely like champagne style bottles.
Really
well.
nice.
Yeah.
So that they're looking towards that trend as well. But the great thing about the you've got the natural probiotics in there. Now there are different ways. You obviously can't pasteurize them. You would normally in a drink. So you have to put them through a very fine filter to ensure you're leaving in the correct, or the probiotics you want to, but taking out anything that can ferment and make the bottle blow. So that it's having a challenge around the processing to ensure that you're keeping the good stuff in there.
Yeah, we've had a number of people inquire about, I'd like to start a kombucha brand or something with a fermented food product, and you just have to sort of explain to them that it is going to mean you probably need to create your own manufacturing facility.
Yeah.
It's quite difficult to find a third party to produce products like this because they're produced in a very different way to standard products. Another product that I tasted quite recently actually was the kimchi from Bottle Brush Ferments. I saw that they had the 3-star Great Taste Award.
Yeah.
And whenever I see that, I sort of think, go on then, let's see if it lives up to that. And I have to say it probably did. It was really tasty. I love the idea of kimchi because I like sauerkraut and those types of things, but often I find them too garlicky and yeah, just a bit overpowering. But this one had a real variety of ingredients in there, really nicely balanced. You obviously get that kind of, there's no other way of saying it, but farty aroma from things like
cabbage,
sauerkraut,
the brassicas, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this one didn't have hardly any of that. And I think it's another sort of evolution that we're seeing is these sort of early adopters and brands that get in there first. It takes a bit of time to get this sort of the taste and the flavour perfected. But that was definitely.
Yeah, I'm still to try it. I mean, I think you said you'd bring some in for me to try, but haven't seen any yet.
Yeah. Might have eaten it all. We can't talk about well fermented food without touching on your sourdough, Micah.
I was wondering when you were going to get around to it because
we have a thing in the office that if you were ever listening to a meeting or a call that you're on, if the sourdough is going to come up because it has appeared in several meetings and calls over the years.
It may have. I'm trying to remember, but I mean, I think the story around it is that when I moved into the suburbs from living in town, it was hard to find sort of good bread. You know, I lived in Islington, used to go to St. John Bakery, pick up some lovely bread on a daily basis. And then I moved out to suburbs and there weren't really those bakeries. I mean, I think it's changed even since then. So that was 12 years ago. And so after a few weeks, I was like, I've got to have some good bread. So I made my own mother. And mother is the thing that is the natural ferment.
The starter.
Yeah, the starter, it's also called. Different ways of making it. You can make it with grapes. You can make it with rhubarb, currants, all these sorts of things. Anyway, I made that and started making my bread about 12 years ago, and I haven't stopped A, baking, or B, going on about it. But what is interesting to me is that as I've got older, whereas I could just eat any old sort of wheat-based, whether it's bread or pastry or whatever, I it doesn't agree with me so much. More indigestion-y sometimes I get. With my sourdough bread, proper sourdough bread that I'd make yourself or you get from a really good baker, don't have any of those problems because you get those changes because of that slow ferment. You get changes within the product that help sort of break down those sort of the gluten into products that your gut can cope with much better.
Yeah, it's like 24, 36 hours from fermentation.
It varies.
Yeah,
it depends how warm
depends what
it
you've got
is.
Going on
it depends what I've got going on. But yeah, I mean, typically I would probably do about a 36-hour turnaround.
And the amount of people who will say they are gluten intolerant and you give them a good piece of sourdough and they're absolutely fine.
Yeah.
And I think that's therefore another trend that we're seeing is people looking at all sorts of products that can just be made more slowly, that sort of slow food movement in a way, and just not in terms of just how it's eaten, but also how it's prepared and the benefits with that. Be interesting to see how many other products and categories that starts to trickle through into.
Yeah, we've covered quite a lot already in this episode, and as we're wrapping up, I think let's just talk about what the future might hold with gut health.
Yeah, one of the most exciting things on the horizon is having tailor-made probiotic strains for you, for the individual.
For me?
Yeah, for you, for myself, for everyone. The gut microbiome is so complex. We spoke at the start about how there's these different groups and families of microbes. They're really just starting to scratch the surface in terms of which ones are beneficial, how much of them you should have. But certain individual microbes are starting to come to the fore as being very impactful. My favourite book on this topic is The Diet Myth by Professor Tim Spector, who we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And I would encourage anyone to go and read this book. And it's one of those great books that you don't have to read it from start to finish. You can sort of drop in and out of chapters if you want. But one of the really key takeaways for me was when they spoke about this microbe that's part of the Firmicutes family called Christensenella, and it's been sort of touted as the lean microbe. There's a number of studies now and research that show a few individuals, less than 10% of the population, who have a high amount of this microbe tend to be the lucky buggers who can eat almost what they want and not put on a lot of weight. Hence why it's called the lean microbe or the anti-obesity microbe, it's been called as well.
Do you know anyone who you think might have this?
I do. My lucky darling wife and her siblings, they can basically, just sort of eat, they eat healthy as well, but they don't think twice about sort of enjoying themselves. And, they're always sort of lean. Whereas I'm the exact opposite. I've just got to look at something and start to think about putting weight on.
Do you think I have some of these?
I wouldn't like to comment.
Okay.
But what's going to be exciting is seeing how they're now looking into, well, how do you get this microbe isolated and turned into a probiotic? And there's going to be others as well. And so I don't know, is it 10, 20, 30 years in the future, but you'll theoretically be able to have your microbiome tested and then a bespoke blend of probiotics sort of prescribed to you that, not just for weight gain purposes, but to help issues with allergies or other sort of, deadly diseases, whatever it might be. So I think that is on the horizon eventually. When it's going to happen, who knows, but quite exciting.
Something I've been reading about, which I think is interesting, is not just about products like you've just spoken, but about how we eat. And one thing that has been in the news and there have been books about it is fasting. So there was a big thing around the 5-2 diet, and then variations of that. And we've both done a bit of fasting. You still do it, don't you?
Most days, intermittent fasting, the 16-8. I hardly ever have breakfast now. I will at the weekend just because I enjoy it. But most weekdays, I won't eat until lunchtime, and then I'll not eat after 8 o'clock. So I have about a 16-hour fasting window. Love it.
And I fast every single day while I'm asleep.
Exactly.
So I'm regular as clockwork. But so people doing that a lot for their weight and so forth. But what's also interesting about fasting is that it can increase the diversity of gut microbes. So this is quite a new discovery. And there's a major microbe, Akkermansia, which loves people who fast, because what it does, it snacks off our gut lining and cleans up all the sort of bad microbes, the things that the ones we don't want. But you've got to watch it like all these things. There can be the other side, because if you fast for too long, they can start attacking the gut lining.
It makes me think of leaky gut syndrome, which I know some people suffer with, and that can be very similar. Whereas if you don't feed the bacteria the good things, the fibre that it needs, it can start to turn on your gut lining for sources. But I think why this is potentially important for brands is you are starting to see now products that are specifically to support fasting, whether it's to supposedly break a fast correctly, whether it's to prepare yourself for a fast. So I think it's quite a new trend, but it sort of links into like the keto diet and other trends as well. I think we're going to see more products that start to support fasting, because it is the amount of evidence that's coming out in recent years to show the benefits of it is, sort of unquestionable.
Yeah. So I think it's time to sum things up, really. And I think it's always good, as we've done in previous episodes, to maybe give a couple of recommendations on things to read or something like that.
Yeah.
The book that I would recommend, now we've talked about Tim Spector more than once in this episode, but after he did The Diet Myth, he did one called Spoon Fed.
Quite recent.
Yeah,
it's year or two, I think, is it?
2020 it was published, and its subheading is Why Almost Everything We've Been Told About Food Is Wrong. Yeah. So that just makes me suddenly think, I want to read that. What it is. Now, it includes a lot of the things in the Diet Myth, but it updates them, because I think the Diet Myth was 2016, and things have moved along so rapidly.
Yeah.
I would, again, anyone who's interested in this, go and buy it, read it. It's a really good read.
Yeah, I've got another one to throw out there, and it's more a sort of an interesting one. It's called "This Is Your Brain on Parasites: How Tiny Creatures Manipulate Our Behavior and Shape Society." So it's by Kathleen McCullough. Apologies, Kathleen, if I got your surname incorrect there. And it starts off with basically suggesting that the microbes that live within us, they can be more responsible for things like our mood than we think. And so there is this question around, throughout history, and the kind of mad dictators or people that have really shaped history, was it them? Was it their microbiome? And reading the book, it really makes you think. So another one to suggest.
Yeah, it's one for me to read. I haven't done that yet.
Yeah. But summing up the episode, I suppose variety, I think, is the first thing I would say.
Key of life.
Yes. In terms of your ingredients, your probiotics, your prebiotics, how your food's sort of prepared, and trying to cut down or minimize processed foods. I mean, this isn't exactly sort of new news to anyone. And I think you've got a quote on that for us to finish on.
Yeah. Michael Pollan, the author of books and other articles, he sums it up in one very short sentence, which is: eat food, not too much, mostly plants.
Nice. Thanks, Micah.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. And for more information, please visit tastehead.com. We hope you join us for our next episode.